You could look at it, it's the best of times, it's the worst of times to start the role. Assisted suicide actually is a bit of a distraction in terms of making sure we have quality, well-funded and politically important palliative care and hospice care and end-of-life care in this country. I don't think it'll ever be off the agenda. So it's important that we're there, we're in the room, we're advising, we're making sure that our supporters' views and our own ideological beliefs are absolutely on the table, and that's what I'm looking forward to doing.
Chris McEleny is a former SNP councillor and was the General Secretary of Alex Salmond's Palliative party. Last month, he became SPUC's first ever Scottish Parliamentary Officer, and Chris joins me now. Chris, thank you for joining me.
Thank you very much for having me.
So you start your term in the post as SPUC's first ever Scottish Parliamentary Officer in what's quite a febrile time for politics. We've just recently had a Scottish Parliament election and lots of new MSPs sitting in at Holyrood. In the past week, we have another UK Prime Minister, the sixth one in 10 years. And literally in recent days, we've just heard that the Scottish Labour Party are now in the process of choosing a new leader. So with all of that in mind, is it important that SPUC have a political presence?
Well, I think you could look at it, it's the best of times, it's the worst of times to start the role. What it does, I think, emphasise is SPUC's commitment to Scotland and the importance of the legislation the Scottish Parliament has been trying to enact and has been enacting over the past few years. And it's fundamentally as important that we have a presence in the Scottish Parliament. We seen in the last session, there was an attempt to bring in assisted suicide legislation. Lots of good partnership working. SPUC, of course, at the forefront of that, helped defeat that bill, which was inherently flawed on many, many ways. The new session, we've seen something like 50% now of MSPs or new MSPs. So what that normally brings, new MSPs want to make a name for themselves, so we could be looking at lots of private members' bills or members' bills in the Scottish Parliament. We could be looking at new personalities for the first time in the devolution era, leading political parties and what direction they take their own political parties in, and indeed the Parliament in, is anybody's guess. So it's important that we're there, we're in the room, we're advising, we're making sure that our, supporters' views and our own ideological beliefs are absolutely on the table, and that's what I'm looking forward to doing.
Now, you mentioned assisted suicide, which, as you rightly say, in recent months was at the top of the agenda. The Scottish Parliament, after a full debate and a vote, decided against Liam MacArthur's assisted suicide bill. For different reasons, another attempt at assisted suicide bill fell at Westminster. And just again in the past week, we've had the new UK Prime Minister, Andy Burnham, saying that he'd like to see more focus on the funding and the provision of end-of-life care. With all of those things in mind, do you think we can breathe a bit of a sigh of relief about assisted suicide at the moment? Is it off the agenda?
I don't think it'll ever be off the agenda, and that's really important as to why we've always got a presence as a campaigning organisation, that our supporters continue to support us so that we can continue to do good work. As I say, new MSPs will come in and they'll think it's their, responsibility to, pick up the baton and take the legislation forward. I would like to see MSPs, concentrate on the, the old bread of, quality housing, fixing the roads, education, employment, in the economy. But I think too many people seem to think, these issues are no longer popular, so let's, concentrate on the societal issues. I think that's why palliative care is important, and it's also really good to hear what the Prime Minister said, because it also backs up what we're trying to do in terms of, talking to MSPs across Scotland. Doesn't matter which local newspaper you read, you will see issues with local hospice funding. We've probably reached the denouement of that in terms of sustainability. If you were to ask a lay person, does it make sense that hospices, which are absolutely vital in society, rely on, people making donations to them, and they only get about half of their funding from central government? Most people say, well, that doesn't make sense. What happens if the donations dry up? So I think there will be particularly considering what the Prime Minister said, there will be a knock-on effect in Scotland, that more focus will be on palliative care, the funding for end-of-life care, and I think that's the real battle. Assisted suicide actually is a bit of a distraction in terms of making sure we have quality, well-funded and politically important palliative palliative care and hospice care and end-of-life care in this country.
So SPUC obviously hopes that renewed focus south of the border on end-of-life care will be matched by a focus on the part of the Scottish Government. And I know that's one of what you have drafted as your five asks, your five priorities or points that you hope the Scottish Government will include in their plan for government. So can we just run through those five and maybe you could explain a bit about what's behind them, what was the thinking in drafting them in the first place, what hopes do you have for the success of those five priorities? So number one is an end to coercion of women into abortion, where what you're saying, what SPUC is saying is no woman should ever be coerced. You've cited survey evidence that around about 15% of women say they did feel pressurised and they did feel coerced. And what is it you're asking for? You want this to become an explicit criminal offence?
There should be a criminal. So, basically 15% in Scotland equates to up to 3,000 women last year and subsequent previous years may well have been coerced into having an abortion. I think that's abhorrent. It's actually a travesty, and regardless of how people describe themselves, particularly in Parliament, whether they support abortion, whether they're pro-abortion or whether they're pro-life, I think we can, I'm hopeful we can form a consensus that surely we're all against the fact that a woman can be getting coerced by a man into having an abortion. There is no specific legislation at the moment, and the lack of specific legislation means that we can't have proper data either into mapping, is this an issue? Every time that we identify that a man has done this and he's prosecuted, we map it and we know what sort of problem we've got. So we don't have that. So that's one of the reasons why we need the legislation, is to have proper evidence-led data so that we can better protect women in society. The second one is the obvious one, is that it's just plainly wrong that a woman, the whole notion of pro-choice is actually quite nonsense when you think that the woman doesn't actually have a choice if there's a man there behind the telephone, she's getting coerced into having an abortion. And that leads us into the next point, of course, which is
number two on your list then is the remote abortion, telemedicine. The pills by post, which was supposed to be a temporary COVID emergency measure that ended when COVID ended, but we still have it.
Yeah, and again, there's an intrinsic link with coercion. So if a woman's on the phone to a medical practitioner saying that she wants to have an abortion, 15% of those women potentially have a man in that room who, she's a victim of domestic violence. There could be cultural issues that, in terms of, we could have a worry about what the sex is going to be, etc. There are a whole raft of reasons that woman could be getting coerced into having an abortion, and telemedicine makes coercion easier. That alone should be, a worry to decision makers. The other issue is that, again, you just have a chronic lack of data. We just don't know how many women are being admitted into hospital for, severe life-threatening issues because of effective failures in telemedicine at-home abortion.
And this is because the drugs have been taken at home?
So the drugs which previously, the woman obviously had to present to a medical setting, she had to have specialist, medical attention, doctors on hand, consultants on hand, nurses on hand when she took the second pill. Now, because of the COVID legislation, the woman is doing that at home. Again, we don't know what situation she's in, we don't know how vulnerable she is, we don't know what the mental health implications are. There are no signposting opportunities for people that, are professionals and can clearly identify, this is a woman I think has been coerced, this is a young woman that I think, there are issues here. This is the fifth time she's presented here, and, highly trained medical practitioners know how to signpost people to make sure they get specialists, whether that's physical, medical or mental support. At home, that doesn't happen. And as I said, we just aren't tracking the data as to knowing how many young women are putting themselves at harm's way and at risk, potentially life-threatening risk. So that's why we're asking decision makers to think again. That you brought this legislation in, obviously, because you had COVID and people weren't able to present at medical facilities, but COVID's gone. So we should go back to the way we were before.
And once COVID ended, all other medical consultations went back to in-person.
Yeah, absolutely. So if you look at the abortion statistics in Scotland, so tragically we hit about 18,000 last year, and there's an absolute correlation between COVID and a massive rise. Now, there was not major barriers in place pre-COVID that stopped women accessing, early term abortion. There just wasn't. It's one of the easiest countries in the world to do that. Present, we know what the legislation is, we know how they access abortion. So the fact that we've had such a massive spike, if I'm a decision maker and I'm looking, why have we went from 9,000 to 10,000 to 12,000 to 18,000, and the last couple of years that 18,000 figure's rising? Well, there's obviously something happened. It's the ease of access to pills by post, but it's not actually that much easier. But that's where my worry is with the coercion factor. All of a sudden now, a woman previously was able to go to the hospital, maybe think about it, speak about it, could potentially take more time to think about a life-changing decision. Now there's a quick, it's an overnight, I want to get this done, and then you regret it the next day. Or again, there could be, that, sinister element that we just aren't really mapping at all.
On that point of the sort of sinister element, which sits side by side with the coercion, there have been a growing number of cases where pills have been obtained, often by a man, and then administered either surreptitiously or forcibly against a woman's will. There have been cases across the UK, there have been cases across the world.
And so there's a human trafficking link to this as well.
There's another element to that.
There's a link, and again, the concern being that, criminal gangs are trafficking women into the country. And now that they can get anyone to effectively phone up and get pills by post, we could have brought a situation in Scotland that we've got brothels that are operating, and in the first aid kit we've got abortion pills there that can be administered to young vulnerable women. And previously when I helped on the communication side of Ash Regan's bill, which was obviously looking at prostitution, we've seen a lot of evidence of just what is going on in that underbelly of Scottish society. So pills by post, again, it just enables so many sinister behaviours that you could just remove overnight by going back to the default position we were in before COVID.
They've been described in some quarters as a charter for abuse.
Yeah.
And from what you've said, that sounds like it's exactly what they are.
Absolutely.
So that's the first 2 points of your 5-point list. Number 3, still on the topic of abortion, is to stop the progress of the so-called expert review group, which was a group set up by the Scottish Government to review abortion. There was no real call or demand for it, but they set up this so-called expert group, which perhaps not surprisingly was almost completely full of people who were totally in favour of abortion, and they've brought forward some recommendations, which certainly SPUC has spoken against and campaigned against. But tell us a bit about what they would like to do and how it can be stopped.
So again, this doesn't jump out as me as a priority of John Swinney as First Minister, nor something he wants his government to get bogged down in. I think the genesis of this group was the Butte House agreement between the Scottish Government and the then Green Party, the influence that they had, and then First Minister Humza Yousaf then, again, without any pressure, as you say, seemed to think this was something he wanted to run on for whatever reason, I don't know. But the findings are just, this is, all of the things that people say are just scare stories have just came to life here. It calls for basically full-term abortion for any reason. No need to even have, general practitioners saying that there is a physical or a mental, risk to the health of the woman. It's just basically it's a lifestyle choice. You want to have an abortion the day before your due date. That shouldn't be illegal in Scotland. I just think that's absurd. I also don't think that's anywhere near in line with public thinking. Obviously, we know there is of course, there's a divide in what people think about abortion and the stage and the amount of weeks in terms of the development of pregnancy, but I think the overwhelming majority of people in Scotland are against, sex-selective abortion, full-term abortion, abortion because a child has a very minor disability. This expert group's basically just saying let's disregard all of that public opinion where people think society should be. So I think that this is actually potentially quite an easy ask for the First Minister and the government, because they've just basically got to come out and say, this review was done, it doesn't reflect the views of the government, and in the programme for government in which we want to focus on, as I said earlier, poverty, housing, education, we're not going to take any of these aspects forward, nor does the government support any of them, and that's that put to bed. And it allows organisations like ourselves and the third sector and the government to dedicate their energies elsewhere instead of something that, quite frankly, should have never seen the light of day.
Let's hope they take that advice and do exactly what you suggest. So number 4 on the list now, we go to the end of life, and it's palliative care, which you did mention earlier on, and the idea that we have been able to hold back the latest attempt at an assisted suicide bill. And one of the outcomes of that debate was many people saying our palliative care and our end-of-life care just isn't supported in the way that it should be. What specifically are you saying on behalf of SPUC to the Scottish Government?
Well, again, the first point there is that for me in the SPUC, this is a moral absolute. You know, there's no set of circumstances that I would say, okay, assisted suicide is okay. But I think what we've seen from a lot of the consultation processes, both in Scotland and the debate with the Leadbeater bill in England, is that safeguarding was the concern, that people said this is whether I'm going to vote for it or not vote for it. And the main one was palliative care. Will this lead to a reduction in palliative care? So I think that there is a consensus that can be formed again there on the fact that we all agree palliative care needs more funding. At the UK level, the Prime Minister has called the major parties together to see if we can effectively, chart a path to how do you fund better palliative care. That potentially could lead to a massive increase in the Scottish Government block grant if the UK government makes a massive decision to have, generational change levels of how we evaluate and treat palliative care, then that's good. So I think it's about, getting the Scottish Government to basically sign up for that. Not that I'm necessarily saying we need to work on a four nations basis, again, the way we did in COVID, but to say, well, obviously this isn't an English and a Welsh only problem. This is a problem across, developed society, that people are living a lot longer. They potentially then are living for 10, 20 or even 30 years or longer in what I would class as, an unhealthy life quality. So how do we better fund that? How do we better fund our care homes? How do we better fund people's, final years in their life? And when they get those illnesses that most families have experienced and no one wants to, how do we fund having the best possible care available?
Because we know from a lot of research and from anecdotal evidence that it's that anxiety about what might happen to someone at the end of their life, whether they'll be in pain, whether they'll be uncared for. That's the anxiety that drives them towards looking for an assisted suicide option.
So as a society, if we can say, well, actually, what do we actually want? Whether, it doesn't matter what your constitutional opinion is, doesn't matter what your party political leanings are, but what do you actually want as your main, values in life? Look after children, look after the elderly, let people have fruitful, meaningful, happy lives, and at the end of life, make sure they can, have dignity, make sure they can respect and world-leading care. And for me, that is a finance issue. So I was totally delighted to see the Prime Minister, for the first time, we've seen somebody basically just say, well, hold on a minute, there is a moral debate going on, I get that, but, first things first, we need to fix palliative care. And I think that we'll see where that goes, and hopefully the Scottish Government will follow suit.
Yeah, well, hopefully fertile ground for you to make exactly that point across the political parties in Scotland. So now to the last of those, this 5 ask list. And it's an interesting one. You are asking, SPUC is asking the Scottish Government to extend the child payments, the Scottish child payment to pregnant mothers. Now, at the moment, payments aren't made to anyone before they're born. That has just been a standard or a given. Why is that being asked, and what impact do you think that could have?
Well, there are a few reasons here. There's the obvious, and then there's maybe some reasons we don't think of. So if we look at the statistics, first of all, again, this year's abortion stat shows that when you talk about, pregnancy being a choice, well, it's not a choice, because the 5 different levels of poverty, from the women in Scotland that are the least deprived all the way down to the very most deprived women. Each drop in level of deprivation, we see the likelihood of an abortion increases. So the most deprived women in Scotland are more likely to have an abortion. So of course there's a poverty-related financial aspect there. So we as a state should empower women to actually don't just say you're pro-choice, be honest about it then. You've got to resource that. You shouldn't have a situation a woman feels that economically she can't go through her pregnancy because she can't afford a child. And I think as a country, we shouldn't, settle that's a societal norm that, women can be priced out of giving birth when they become pregnant. The health statistics shows that, the more impoverished a woman is, and if she has an access to basic essentials, there's a real risk of early labour and pregnancies that, don't go to full term. And the vast majority in Scotland of pregnancies that are early, and women, get into all sorts of issues in terms of their child's born, far too, low in weight, with a host of medical conditions. Again, that's poverty related. It's the stats tell us that. The more deprived they are, the more likelihood they'll go into labour early, their child will be low in weight, etc. So, of course, we need to be supporting women throughout their whole pregnancy, but that final trimester, you can map it out, those issues, through life, through curriculum for excellence, through, how they map in terms of nursery performance, primary education performance, secondary education, and the attainment gap is all intrinsically linked to, in the womb. It doesn't start at basically day one when you're on this planet. It's, the things that happen to a child in pregnancy fundamentally impact a child's life chances for the rest of their life. So the Scottish Government, and I totally believe and take at face value the First Minister when he says that poverty and eradicating it is going to be his, number one priority. If they want to do that, I think that they could be world leading, which previous governments have maybe get caught up in that phrase, to want to be world leading. This is something you truly could be world leading on, and in Scotland, pregnant mothers could get a financial benefit of the Scottish Child Payment at the start of their final trimester.
Is it just on that one? Would it be a significant amount of money?
Well, millions of pounds are big numbers, but about £7 or £8 million in the grand scheme of the Social Security Scotland budget is, it's less than a fraction of 1% of the budget. The bureaucratics of it are simple because it's the same women that would be having to apply for the Scottish Child Payment anyway. So it's not as if it's absolutely. It's not as if this is a whole cohort of extra people you're extending a benefit to. It's the people that would be entitled to it anyway, through access and other benefits that are available, such as the Scottish Baby Box. There's an easy instrument there already that you can apply for it. So I think it would be game changing. Scottish Child Payment is already a game changer. The £28, whatever it'll go up to with inflation next, but if you were giving that money to a woman early, the Baby Box is great, right? It's got the essential, but it is the bare essentials. There's other things that, women need, particularly women, again, that have managed to resist coercion, that have managed to resist potentially an abusive relationship and, the poverty that they're living in, to basically get themselves into the best possible position to bring their baby into the world, into a good environment, and importantly, not have to, get themselves potentially further into debt before the baby's even here. So,
but it's interesting, isn't it? Our Chief Medical Officer and the medical establishment general would say, for example, pregnant women shouldn't drink alcohol during pregnancy. In other words, what they're saying is what happens and the choices you make during pregnancy could have quite significant effects, which is tying in completely with what you're saying, and that is, here's an option, here's a choice that would apply during pregnancy and could also have significant effects. And it gets us into trying to make people think in a way that the SPUC has tried to do literally for decades, about the unborn child, about the unborn child as a person. The point of birth, in some senses, is almost abstract in that they don't stop developing, or they don't rather start developing the day they're born. They've been developing all the way through
for 9 months. And you say, we know that the data's there, whether it's babies that are born with fetal alcohol syndrome, whether it's babies that are born, maybe say 8 weeks to 2 to 3 months early, that are extremely severely underweight. Again, the stats always show us that you're more likely to be in that situation if you're living in the most deprived communities in Scotland. So if we can put that extra financial resource in, which again, in the grand scheme of the Scottish Government's budget, it's a small number, but I think it could lead to a game-changing improvement to women's lives, how we treat unborn children, how we treat pregnancy. And I just think the state recognising that basically life has begun in that womb, I think that would be quite fundamentally, use that word quite a lot today, but it would be game-changing. And I think it's, if you're a Scottish Government that's potentially in arrears over the last few years in terms of some of the toxic debates that you've got into, I think it's a really good positive policy, in terms of supporting children, trying to eradicate child poverty and supporting women as well.
Well, it sounds as if you have got your work cut out for you, because these are all big asks. They are fundamental, they're fascinating, and they're totally justified. So on behalf of SPUCTV, we wish you every bit of luck in pushing this forward and advancing all of these arguments, and hopefully we can check back in with you at some point over the term of this Parliament and find out how things are going. But for now, Chris, thanks for joining us.
Thank you very much.